July 1945. The war in Europe is over. The Nazi war machine has collapsed. Hitler is dead, or so the world is told. Millions are still counting their dead. Nuremberg is being planned. And yet, 2 German U-boats are cutting silently through the South Atlantic, running deep, running dark, heading not toward surrender, not toward home, but toward Argentina. They carried no orders that have ever been fully explained. They carried no cargo that has ever been fully accounted for, and what happened when they surfaced has never been fully resolved. This is the story of the ghost submarines, the mystery that outlived the war, and the questions that still don't have answers. To understand what happened in the South Atlantic in the summer of 1945, you have to understand what German U-boats were and what they had become by the war's final days. At their peak, the Kriegsmarine submarine force was the most feared naval weapon on Earth. U-boats prowled the Atlantic in coordinated wolf packs, strangling Allied supply lines and sending millions of tons of shipping to the ocean floor. For a time, they nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic on their own. But by 1945, the tide had long turned. Allied anti-submarine technology, air cover, and intelligence, much of it derived from cracking the Enigma cipher, had devastated the U-boat fleet. Thousands of German submariners were dead, hundreds of vessels destroyed. When Germany surrendered on the 8th of May 1945 VE Day, Admiral Karl Dönitz issued a direct order to all remaining U-boats: surface, fly a black flag, and surrender to the nearest Allied force. Most did, but not all. 2 submarines chose a different course entirely. Their names, U-530 and U-977. Their destination, the Argentine port city of Mar del Plata, roughly 400 kilometers south of Buenos Aires. No one authorized it. No one can fully explain it. And the crews, when questioned, told stories that raised more questions than they answered. The 10th of July, 1945. More than 2 months after Germany's unconditional surrender, a ghost appeared in the waters off Mar del Plata. U-530 surfaced and made contact with Argentine authorities. The sight was extraordinary. A German war submarine, fully intact, arriving at a neutral port long after the fighting had ended. No distress signal, no damage, no explanation that made complete sense. The commander was Captain Lieutenant Otto Wermuth, 25 years old. His crew numbered 54 men. Argentine naval authorities took them into custody immediately and notified Allied intelligence. What followed was an interrogation that produced something unusual, a story riddled with gaps. Wermuth claimed that U-530 had been at sea since before the German capitulation, that they had received news of Hitler's death and the surrender via radio, and that they had simply decided to head to Argentina rather than return to a Germany under Allied occupation. On the surface, perhaps plausible, but Allied investigators noticed something immediately. The submarine's logbook was incomplete. Pages appeared to have been removed or altered. The crew was evasive on key details, specifically about their activities in the weeks before arrival. Where had they been? What had they been carrying? Why Argentina, when surrender to Allied naval forces in the North Atlantic would have been straightforward? The Argentines handed the crew over to US authorities, who subjected Wermuth and his men to extensive questioning. The Americans were particularly interested in one specific possibility, one that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe, but they asked it anyway. Had U-530 transported Nazi leadership, possibly Hitler himself, to South America? Do you think U-530 could have secretly transported high-ranking Nazi leaders, possibly even Hitler, to South America? Share your theory in the comments. Wermuth denied it. Then, 6 weeks later, a second submarine arrived. The 17th of August, 1945. U-977 surfaced off Mar del Plata, another German U-boat, another crew with an extraordinary story. Its commander was Oberleutnant Heinz Schäfer, 24 years old, disciplined and clearly prepared for the interrogation that awaited him. Schäfer's account of the voyage was, in some ways, even more remarkable than Wermuth's. He claimed that upon hearing of Germany's surrender, he had given his married crew members the option to disembark on the Norwegian coast and return home. 17 men took that offer. The remaining crew agreed to sail on to Argentina. What followed, according to Schäfer, was one of the most extraordinary voyages of the entire war. U-977 allegedly spent 66 days submerged, running on battery power for stretches that pushed the vessel and crew to their absolute limits, crossing the South Atlantic without surfacing in a way that would expose them to Allied detection. 66 days. It was, if true, a feat of navigation, discipline, and sheer endurance that bordered on the unbelievable. Allied interrogators were skeptical, not just of the feat, but of the motive. Why would a crew of German sailors, with the war already lost, risk everything for a journey to South America? Why not surrender? Why not go home? Schäfer's answer was simple: fear of Allied punishment and a belief that Argentina, with its large German-descended population and its history of neutrality, offered safety. But Allied intelligence believed something else might have been at play. They asked Schäfer the same question they'd asked Wermuth. Had U-977 carried passengers, high-ranking Nazis, Hitler? Schäfer, like Wermuth before him, said no. Almost from the moment Germany fell, rumors had spread that the Nazi leadership, or at least parts of it, had escaped the Allied net. The so-called Ratlines underground escape routes that moved former Nazis through neutral countries, often to South America, were real. That much has been confirmed by decades of historical research. Prominent Nazis did escape to Argentina. Adolf Eichmann, the chief architect of the Holocaust's logistics, lived in Buenos Aires under a false name until Israeli intelligence agents captured him in 1960. Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz physician known as the Angel of Death, fled to South America and died there in 1979, never brought to justice. Argentina, in the immediate post-war period, under President Juan Perón, was not unfriendly to German immigrants, including those with dark pasts. The evidence for that is abundant. So the question became, could the Ratlines have extended to the sea? Could U-boats have been used to transport the highest-ranking Nazis, or even Hitler himself, before the fall of Berlin? The official account, accepted by mainstream historians, is that Adolf Hitler died by suicide in his bunker in Berlin on the 30th of April, 1945. Soviet forces captured the Reich Chancellery, identified remains, and the case for most historians is closed. But several factors have kept the conspiracy theory alive. The Soviet Union, for decades, refused to release the dental and skeletal evidence they claimed to possess. When they finally did, questions about the chain of custody arose. In 2018, a team of French forensic scientists was granted access to teeth held in Russian archives, purported to be Hitler's. Their analysis concluded that teeth matched historical dental records, but critics noted the samples had never been subjected to DNA testing under fully independent conditions. And then there were the Argentine rumors. Declassified FBI documents, real, verified, accessible today, show that American intelligence took reports of Hitler's possible survival seriously enough to investigate. Multiple informants reported sightings of a man believed to be Hitler in Argentina in the months and years after the war. The FBI did not conclude Hitler had survived, but they investigated. And 2 German submarines arriving in Argentina months after surrender with incomplete logs and evasive crews arrived right in the middle of all of it. Allied intelligence threw significant resources at unraveling the Mar del Plata mystery. Both crews were interrogated at length, first by Argentine authorities, then by US Navy intelligence officers. The sessions were thorough. Wermuth and Schäfer were questioned separately, their accounts compared for inconsistencies. In the end, American investigators concluded officially that neither submarine had carried Hitler or senior Nazi leadership. The conclusion was based on crew testimony, physical examination of the vessels, and a lack of corroborating evidence. But the investigation raised questions it never fully answered. The missing logbook pages from U-530 were never recovered. Why do you think pages were removed from the U-530 logbook to hide a secret mission, destroyed cargo records, or something even bigger? Tell us what you believe. The exact route U-977 took across the Atlantic was never completely verified. And the question of why these particular submarines made this particular voyage, when so many others had simply surrendered, remains without a definitive answer. Heinz Schäfer later wrote a memoir, published in 1952, titled U-977. In it, he maintained that the voyage was an act of individual decision-making, that his crew chose Argentina freely, out of fear and uncertainty about post-war Germany. Argentine author Abel Basti spent decades investigating the theory that Hitler survived and lived out his days in Patagonia. His books, while controversial and disputed by mainstream historians, drew on local testimonies, land records, and declassified documents to build a circumstantial case. Mainstream historians reject the Hitler in Argentina thesis as unproven and inconsistent with the weight of evidence, but they also acknowledge one inconvenient truth. The full picture of what those 2 submarines were doing in the South Atlantic in the summer of 1945 has never been completely assembled. History is rarely a clean line from event to explanation. Wars produce chaos, chaos produces gaps, and gaps, especially in stories as dramatic as this one, tend to fill with speculation. What we know for certain: 2 German submarines arrived in Argentina months after the war ended. Their crews were evasive on key details. Physical evidence from the boats was incomplete. Allied intelligence investigated seriously and drew official conclusions, but never answered every question. What remains disputed: whether those submarines carried cargo, passengers, or information that has never been disclosed. Whether the escape of senior Nazis via sea routes connected in any way to these specific voyages. And whether the full story of what happened in the South Atlantic in the summer of 1945 is one we will ever completely know. The ocean keeps its secrets well. Wermuth was eventually released and returned to Germany. Schäfer emigrated to Argentina, the very place he had sailed to, and later moved to the United Kingdom. He maintained his story until his death. U-530 and U-977 were examined by Allied engineers, stripped of intelligence value, and eventually destroyed. The port at Mar del Plata still stands, ships still move through it. And somewhere in the South Atlantic, the water is as dark and as silent as it was on those July nights in 1945. The Mar del Plata mystery sits at the intersection of 3 of the most powerful forces in history: war, power, and the desperate human instinct for survival. Whatever those submarines carried or didn't carry, they arrived as symbols of something the post-war world was still processing. The idea that the men who had built one of history's most murderous regimes might simply disappear. That justice might not reach them. That some stories might not end the way history books require them to. We know the Nazis lost the war. We know the Reich collapsed. We know that many of those responsible faced justice at Nuremberg and in the decades that followed. But we also know that some escaped. That some lived out comfortable lives under assumed names in countries that asked few questions. The 2 U-boats at Mar del Plata remain, in the end, a question mark stamped on the final pages of World War II. Not proof of anything extraordinary, but not entirely explained by anything ordinary either. History rarely gives us clean endings. Only the ocean gets to keep its silence forever. Subscribe to Steel and Strategy and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden history of military conflict, the operations, the decisions, and the mysteries that history textbooks leave out. If this story made you think, drop your theory in the comments below. We read everyone. And if you want to go deeper, check out our playlist on secret operations of World War II, linked on screen right now. Steel and Strategy, where history is never simple and the truth is always worth pursuing.